Thanks for having me. I reached out to David just a couple weeks ago and you put me right on this agenda. So I appreciate it on this warm summer evening. And I fit in blueberry picking before getting back to my computer. It was the first day. If anyone has not been to Rocky Point Blueberry Farm, go. It's the best blueberry farm around. And and there was concerts going on in the park tonight that I could have gone to.
Oh,
But
wow.
it's great and it's reasonable and they were prolific. Um, so that's what dinner was. And I think I met with you all about 2 years ago when
Mm.
we were beginning the restoration planning for the Soames Preserve. And Save the Bay had been working um, with the land trust and the town and Natural Resource Conservation Service for, I think like 2017. I think I did some outreach to the former property owner, and it took a long while. But the easement was secured, and the partnership with the land trust, she felt comfortable with donating the land to the land trust. And so Rock and myself, we've been now going the next step now that the land's preserved for um, habitat for restoration. We're now doing the habitat restoration work, which is exciting. And I'm learning more and more that with sea level rise, we really need to be protecting the not just restoring what's happening on the marsh itself, but protecting inland, because that's where the salt marshes want to go. And they've been moving inland since glaciation, but probably not at this rate because of accelerated sea level rise. So I thought I could just give you, I'm going to breeze through because I did share some of these slides, but I'm not sure if everyone was here when I talked to you all a couple years ago, just about what we're seeing in salt marshes. And then I have some images from what we're working on at Soames Preserve with Rock and the Land Trust and NRCS on the Palmer, which I didn't realize the Palmer was referred to as the Soames River. I love the fact that we have the Soames Preserve on the Soames River. And so the more ways we can reconnect people by place name to these areas that have importance with regards to indigenous culture as well as ecological value, I think that's a great way to connect people to these places. So that was, I read through the your, what is it called, the feasibility study for the heritage area designation, and that was something that was new to me. So I'm gonna can I share my screen?
Yeah,
um
I've set it up for you.
okay, and more, share screen. Okay, so I'm gonna go to this. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, so hopefully this is going to work. There we go. So I think I shared some of these images with you, so I'm going to breeze through this. But I've been working at Save the Bay for 33 years now, and we've been doing salt marsh restoration work for the last since the mid 90s. And a lot of the first projects we worked on were major construction activities, removing or upgrading culverts or pipes under roadways to allow more salt water in and out of a salt marsh, removing fill from salt marshes. And in the last 14 or so years, we've been doing smaller scale projects where we've been trying to restore the hydrology, the way the water flows in and out of the marsh, that's been impacted by more subtle changes, subtle impacts, human impacts to the marsh. And a lot of these were from agricultural activities dating back to the colonists as early as the 1600s. You can actually see in this picture a stone wall right along here. There is an agricultural berm right along this edge of the marsh, if you can see my cursor. And these are very subtle A wall is pretty easy to pick out, but these berms are much more subtle. So we've been trying to figure out ways to restore hydrology to prevent what we see here, this impounded water on the marsh that causes the vegetation to die off, the marsh peat to sink, and it can create mosquito breeding habitat. So these are some of the conditions we've been observing across the region as marshes become impacted by this by these past legacy impacts, as well as by, I might admit, I wonder if I can, I just got to admit someone, David. So Adam White just joined. So we are seeing this kind of trajectory of degradation. Another interesting thing is in some of these marshes, we get these large algae blooms on the marsh surface. And when I see that algae growing, it's a sign that the peat is sinking and releasing nutrients. So that's something my colleague had determined by doing something called an isotope study. And she found that the nutrients feeding the algae bloom were actually from not wastewater, not stormwater runoff, but actually decaying salt marsh peat. So by reversing that, allowing the water to drain off, we're seeing revegetation and less algae mats and the marsh able to build elevation. And in this little image here, this little dark patch, those are mosquito larvae, also reducing mosquito breeding habitat. Because in these stagnant pools, there are no fish. And if there are no fish, the mosquitoes do very well. There's no predators. So I'll skip over this. It's basically showing that we're seeing this trajectory that we're losing we're losing high marsh, the grasses that grow on the marsh platform, and we're seeing more of these bare areas. So some of the work that we've been doing over the last decade, a little more than a decade now, is smaller scale. And we're trying again to restore hydrology using some low-tech techniques. And then we've gone, and I don't know if I shared this with you, we've done 4 massive projects in Rhode Island in the last decade where we've actually filled a salt marsh that has been so degraded that we elevated it because there was really not much left. So here, Save the Bay and all of us probably have fought filling of wetlands. And now, as a restoration technique, we are actually bringing in sand from dredging activities and elevating the marsh just enough so it can support salt marsh vegetation, because we're losing, the marsh has degraded to a point where it's not coming back. And then up in the migration corridor where the upland meets the salt marsh, we're doing projects with communities where we're pulling back human infrastructure like old roadways that are no longer needed, and trying to protect land like we did on the Somes Preserve, and trying to figure out how can we create a nice area, suitable area for the marsh to migrate as sea levels continue to rise. This is just a little bit about how the farmers, the early colonists into the, probably late 1800s, early 1900s, were actively farming salt marshes. And it makes a lot of sense because those early colonists had livestock and sheep and goats, and they needed hay for food, for bedding. And they were looking at these large grasslands that happened to be salt marsh, and they were manipulating the way the water flowed in and out. And this is one of these agricultural embankments that this one rock, I think, is at Hale Preserve. I think this is one at Hale. And they're very subtle. They're not too large, but it behooved the farmer of the time to try to keep salt water from getting into the upper sections of the salt marsh because they could grow more valuable grass or hay. And up in the North Shore of Boston, they were actually growing some like a sugar beet, which was used for cattle food for cattle. In our marshes, there was a lot of grazing of cattle as well. So you'll find these stone walls along the upper edge of the marsh to keep the cattle from going out too far into the salt marsh. And then along the ditches, we have what are these little high areas on either side where the ditch spoils were placed when they dug them. And those have acted to impound water on either side of the ditch. And back in the 30s, when all of the mosquito during the WPA and the efforts to try to reduce mosquito breeding, they dug those ditches and widened them and deepened them more so than the farmers did. But we think they used a lot of the old agricultural ditches and just expanded upon them. So all of these little features have affected the way the water flows in and out of the marsh and has caused some of this degradation. Then you add the fact that we have sea level rise rates increasing by only a couple millimeters a year over the last 30 years, but that's enough to have an impact in an area that is, right at the tide line. And so I think between these two factors, we're seeing a lot of degradation. And then we're seeing impounded water in the area where the marsh wants to migrate. This is down at Sepauwett Marsh in Tiverton. So these are some of the drainage features we've been digging either by hand or with low ground pressure excavators. This one was actually dug by a low ground pressure excavator. It's that small. You could see this was before the amount of water sitting on the marsh. Immediately after, we were doing this when COVID was starting. And then we continued to hand dig these drainage features. Once we got some drainage, we continued to do a little more kind of a phased approach to drainage. And I was just out there actually last week, and this is that same area. So you can see if you allow the water to drain out, vegetation starts to come in, it starts to stabilize the peat. And instead of the marsh sinking, the marsh is able to build elevation. So this is encouraging to see if you haven't lost too much elevation, you can actually get the area for plants to revegetate. And then what we do with the peat, instead of making these linear ditch boils along the ditches, we place the peat in small piles, not too high, just so it could create an area for a little higher marsh elevation. And within a growing season, it revegetates. And this is an image of one of our peat islands on the Narrow River, revegetating with some high marsh species, which is really beneficial for the salt marsh sparrow, which only nests on the salt marsh. And they need these little higher elevation areas to protect their nest from flooding. Which unfortunately this season, every moon tide has been significant and much higher than predicted. And most likely, there's been a lot of nest failure this year for the salt marsh sparrows, which are very threatened. So these little oases can help, create some habitat that was less likely to flood. So over the last, I would say a decade, we've been looking at the Palmer River in particular because there aren't many places in the Narragansett Bay region other than the Taunton River watershed and the Palmer and a little bit, and the Kickamuit, but it's been dammed, where there's some gradual area for the marsh to migrate. And then on top of it, not all of it's been developed. So these are maps showing where the marsh would want to migrate. Basically, they're sea level projection maps. This is the marsh today, kind of in yellow. And then this is where the marsh wants to be in brown, with 3 feet of sea level rise. And you can see, here's downtown Warren, which we know is vulnerable, especially over Market Street. And Belcher Cove, that whole area, Child Street. But you can see this area here in these fields where there's room for migration. So that's why the Land Trust, myself, back in 2016, started looking at trying to do some outreach to these property owners to see if we could protect this land that
And
is still open, is still undeveloped. And
we could see the Belcher Cove connecting with the Kickamuit River at some point.
yeah, and isn't that crazy that here, and I can get to that on the Kickamuit. So what we're working also on the Kickamuit Dam removal. I've been working with Bristol County Water for the last 7 years on that project. We finally got all our permits 2 weeks ago, and we got our bids back, and it's a lot more expensive than it was when we got the cost estimates 2 weeks ago, or 2 years ago, excuse me. But I just wrote another $600,000 grant on Friday. And we're looking for additional funding. But isn't it amazing through the Lyle farm and then into, I'm forgetting who owns this parcel, Rock. But it's a low parcel that used to have cattle there right along the Kickie. And that is an area where the two estuaries are going to combine under future sea level rise scenarios. And why I was so interested in looking at the Kickamuit for dam removal, these freshwater wetlands, it's beautiful up there. And I'm not exactly sure where the Kickamuit's, because Kickamuit, does it mean spring, freshwater spring? That's what I've understood the Kickamuit to mean. And I think the springs are someplace up in these red maple swamps.
One of the authors, Christine DeLucia, spent 2 years searching for the Kickamuit Spring and never found it.
Never found it. Interesting.
Right. But we know up in that property, particularly the Birch Swamp Road area and back behind there, Devil's Rock in that area, there likely are a number of springs there.
Maybe, up in this upper area.
Yep, correct.
So today, the Kickamuit River, as you know, is very susceptible to flooding. The lower impoundment's already converted to brackish conditions. We've been monitoring it for the last 3 years, and especially during drought years, it's pretty high salinity. And I was very surprised that even the upper Kickamuit during the 2020 and 2022 drought, because there's no difference in the water elevation between the two impoundments, when no fresh water is coming down from the streams during a big tide, like a king tide, water starts flowing back up. And we've gotten very low salinity levels right about here at the right above the berm of the upper Kickie Dam. So you can see why on the salt marsh, future of salt marsh is why I've been focusing on this area. And so we've been partnering with the Land Trust, with Town of Warren, Bristol County Water, over in Barrington on a variety of projects. And one of the first larger scale projects that we did in this region was at Jacobs Point with the Land Trust, going back starting about 25 years ago. And we addressed this roadway, which could have been an old agricultural embankment rock. And then the person who owned, Mr. Hanley, who owned the seaplane and would store it out here near the river, he probably added fill to it. But though that road or restriction started flooding water, causing the marsh to flood, we put in new culverts, and then we started to see revegetation. But interestingly enough, we went back about 5 years after we did the larger scale project, and we started noticing again this kind of degraded early die-off. Very, the vegetation just cannot grow in standing water. And if you look along here, you'll see this straight line. There's a stone wall. Part of it's subsided under the marsh platform. It's right about there. And it lines up exactly where the water is impounded. So these very subtle features are impounding water on the marsh. And back in 2015, we opened up an existing ditch, an agricultural ditch most likely, and then dug these shallow runnels by hand and drained the water. And the exciting thing is that that's that same image, same area, a little further zoomed out. And it's come back with high marsh grasses, which are suitable for our salt marsh sparrows to nest. And the Salt Marsh Sparrow Initiative with Steve Reinhardt and Deirdre Robinson has been working with the Land Trust in monitoring. I think this is the 6th or 7th year salt marsh sparrow population. And they actually found a nest right adjacent to one of our runnels. And I know that area was void of vegetation back in 2015. So it shows that we can change the habitat and make it more suitable for salt marsh sparrows.
That whole area has really come back. It's really amazing. The 20 years I've been watching it. Yeah.
Yeah. So it take now, David, we have to go back and maintain this site. So what I wanted to share with you is a little bit about what we've done. And then this is a Somes Preserve, what we're planning to do, and get your input. This is the parcel that the Land Trust owns. This is the parcel that was donated, and they already owned this little section, that little island here. And the great thing is we're working both in the upland and freshwater wetland as in removing invasives. The Land Trust is leading on that. And then all these little channels, we are doing the work in the marsh. And we're connecting some of these drainage features up to old agricultural ditches that extended all the way up into the upland and into the wet meadow. So these are some of the conditions that were on the ground last summer. Very stagnant water, tons of mosquitoes breeding in this area. You can see from the 39 aerial image this straight line along the upper edge of the marsh. That's one of those agricultural embankments. There are walls as well as these earthen embankments. And over time, we started here, you can see it in the 1990s, not as clear as the 30s. And then notice what happens in here, this brown vegetation that looks a little darker. That's Phragmites. That's an invasive plant. It likes to grow in that upper edge where that fresh water was getting stuck along those impoundments or along those embankments. And it started to outcompete the native vegetation. So that was what we started in the spring of last year, and with the excavators back in December. And this is just showing that same parcel. Here it is, this parcel here. And this is where this is going up to almost 9 feet of sea level rise. You can see the whole farm is going to basically convert to all this kind of light beige area. Could be future marsh. That's definitely an extreme scenario, but it shows we have that nice gentle grade for salt marsh migration. And this is a close-up of our restoration plan, managing the invasives up in the fields and planting with more natives. And there are a lot of natives that are coming back, which is exciting. A lot of diversity. And then here are some images from what we've been doing since last fall. We've had groups out from URI. These folks were out on it was such a mild winter, unfortunately. The only benefit is we were able to work all winter, and these folks were out on a February day working with us. After the excavator is done with the work, as I mentioned, we keep doing hand work and expanding upon and extending these drainage features.
It's the place has been transformed. It's very visible, all the improvements there.
And we're going to go out in the fall or late summer and actually monitor. We have vegetation monitoring, water level monitoring, and monitoring at least presence absence of mosquito larvae as well. So it'll be interesting, and we'll be sharing that information and writing it up. Just to the north, we've been working with the Land Trust on the Hale Preserve. And this is not only are we looking at the marsh, which is this area, this lower area. We've been also working with the town for the last at least 4 years. Rock and myself, this is a stormwater detention basin that was never maintained, built for a large commercial and residential property, poorly designed, and it's degrading. It discharges right into this section of the marsh. And when you look back over aerial imagery, there was no Phragmites in this section of marsh prior to that retention pond coming in. And of course, that retention pond is bringing all this fresh water via a pipe system, a storm drain system, and dumping it into the salt marsh and the brackish marsh. And it's changed the conditions. So we're working on a plan to retrofit this, try to figure out places we can infiltrate the stormwater further inland. Here's the retention pond, what it looks like on a nice summer day. This was extreme algal bloom, but this is actually a pond right here. This lower left picture. And trying to create conditions that are less impactful to the marsh, as well as this pond, this man-made pond, is now a source of nutrients and pollutants to the Palmer River. So that's another project. We're also working on trying to remove the section of the Shad Factory pipeline that is above ground, and it was part for the Bristol County Water's water supply, bringing water from up on the upper Palmer River down to the Kickamuit treatment plant. And this is what that pipeline, you could see the line here above ground.
Are we looking at Swansea or Rehoboth?
This is actually, this is just north of, you know what, I zoomed in here. This is north of the irrigation pond at the Swansea Country Club. Okay. So this is where it comes above ground. It goes underneath the Wampanoag Golf Course to the north, and then it comes up above ground, and then it continues south and then goes underground again on just above the Hale Preserve. And the reason I was showing this picture a while ago was showing how the erosion has increased along these creeks and is now even jeopardizing the pipeline, as you can see, and the footings of the pipeline. So we're working with Bristol County Water, trying to find funding so we can start to remove it before a huge storm comes in and discards it everywhere and makes, more of a huge impact with regards to, public safety, environmental degradation, the whole thing. So that's another project. Oh, here's a close-up of a section of it. And
do you have the funds to remove it?
Not yet. We're working. All these projects we're working on funding. Poor Steve Kutu, who manages Bristol County Water. Every time I call him, he's like, "What do you want now?" I'm like, "We're working on a lot of different projects with them." But it's this infrastructure is no longer needed. They're working on a backup water supply up to Pawtucket. So, and who would want a drinking water pipeline across a salt marsh? Not a resilient pipeline. So it's better. We're trying to remove it. Down at Fogland, on the Sakonnet River, we're working with the town of Tiverton. We've been doing dune restoration since Superstorm Sandy, or I got involved post Superstorm Sandy. Over the last 4 years, we've been restoring some dunes along the beachfront, and I'm working with them on both doing work in the marsh. The marsh is on the north side of the road, this area here, and we're trying to address some flooding on the access road coming into the Fogland management area. And I don't know if you guys can see this square in the bottom corner. That's a 1990 something aerial image. And any idea what that square is? It used to be open water.
I hope it's not sewage discharge.
Nope. So I was looking at aerial imagery and I was like, well, today it's filled with Phragmites. You would never even know it's there. But there's this berm right along the edge of it, and it holds fresh water. It was a skating pond. So they made a skating pond. If you look back over earlier aerials, you'll see it's open water. It would freeze, and they had a skating pond down there. So what we're doing is we're going to reconnect this freshwater wetland underneath this road and out to the north, and there's no path for the water. We're going to create just a small drainage feature underneath the roadway. And then we're managing stormwater that flows. It's a pretty steep hill that flows down to this low point and try to reduce the amount of runoff that gets down there. So it's a little bit of a restoration project and a community resilience project to try to reduce flooding of the road. But this is where the marsh wants to go into the future. So we're going to be removing that berm, and that one just got permitted and will be happening in the fall, which is exciting. And then also in Tiverton, I know we were talking about the Palmer. I've been working at Sepauwett for a number of years with DEM. Fish and Wildlife owns a lot of the fields as well as the marsh. And so we've been doing work in the marsh along Sepauwett Point. And why I wanted to look at this larger aerial imagery, these ponds, and this is information that I've been learning, which is kind of exciting to be working in marshes for a number of years and be learning a lot of new information about how these marshes were used and manipulated and degraded. So I always thought these large features were natural pools on the marsh. And that's where a lot of salt marsh ecologists, that's what they thought they were. And when I was out there doing some restoration work last fall, I noticed this large mudflat area right around here. I'm going to zoom in. This is that same feature taken about 5 years ago. Do you notice these straight lines that are on the north side of it? You don't see anything on the south side. And then you see this straight line going east-west. What happened was this breached, and this was probably a berm right here. And it was, it drained out, and clearly it wasn't a pool. The earliest aerial imagery we have of this area was from 1939, and it was open water, looked like a large pool. But once it drained out, and now the water flows out this way through what most likely was an agricultural berm, there is an old stone, almost like a cart path, and then ditches, which you can't see in this image. There are ditches throughout here. And of course, you weren't ditching an open pool. You were ditching a marsh. But most likely what happened was they were farming this area. The creek filled in, the agricultural ditch filled in, and then it started to flood. And this has probably been open water for over 100 plus years, and we've seen the marsh platform degrade. So we're looking at our marshes very differently and how they've been impacted. But to see that underneath this, what we thought was a natural pool feature, this old farming road is pretty remarkable.
I think what you're showing us is the difference between colonial efforts to manage the environment, particularly for economic reasons, versus what you're doing, which is a restoration process, and returning and re-engineering the land to its pre-colonial state.
And it's a big assumption that we're doing, restoring to a pre-colonial state, because we really don't know what these marshes were like. But we know that there weren't straight lines and berms on them that were, ecologically, that's not how they formed. And indigenous communities, and I defer to you all, how the use of it was quite different, because there wasn't the need for so much hay because of not having significant livestock. And so I think that's, like, again, we knew that there was salt marsh hay, we knew there was agricultural activities, but I don't think we knew how much manipulation was going on these marshes. And now we're kind of peeling back, and every time I go out there now, I find more agricultural features. Here's another one. Here's one of those open pools. Again, it looks like a pool, but now you dig down, and I can dig down a foot below the surface, all water, and I can find old peat, and you can find root fragments, which are probably 150 years old. So here we are draining by hand one of these open water features. And we don't expect that they're going to that's going to convert to salt marsh, but we're hoping that all the salt marsh vegetation around it that's getting flooded and starting to die off, the pool's kind of creeping out. We're hoping we can reduce that trajectory, or change the trajectory, and at least restore some of the vegetation, and maybe get a little more vegetation growing into the pool. But some of these areas have subsided so much we don't expect to see vegetation.
Well, Tracy, you might want to comment on the fact that the Poconokeets have been working the environment for eons, and it's not true that people just left things the way they were. There were all kinds of efforts to change the environment to their advantage. But unfortunately, the colonial notion of what's a good environment differed highly from what the Pokanoket understanding of what a good environment was.
Yeah, there is a lot of truth, to that. And, as was referred to, we had different use for the land, and, our view of ownership of the land and just staying in one place was totally different, as well. So, our footprint on the land wasn't as permanent, I guess you could say, as what the colonists did.
For
And
sure.
that's what's so interesting, Tracy, like the permanence of these impacts are pretty significant. Here's a wall. I'm reading a book right now. And I don't have it. I can't remember. I'm awful remembering names of books, but it's about colonial history, and hearing how Roger Williams, by like 1630 something, had already bought, or I'm not sure if it was actually bought, but had taken ownership of Prudence and or Patience, I think both, and was grazing cattle on it. And I can imagine that he hadn't been clearing all the land. He was probably grazing on the marshes in the by 1630 something. There's documentation of him having cattle out on those islands. So, some of these wall features, I'd love to do some, work with some archaeologists to like, how can you tell how old a stone wall is? And so here's another one of these stone walls along the upper edge, and you can't see it, but this dark area is water that's impounded behind this stone wall, and that's again a large a group of mosquito larvae in April. So nice warm conditions back there, perfect for mosquitoes to breed because there are no fish. So I'm going to just go quickly through this. I mentioned marsh migration. I kind of look at all of our projects as where the marsh can go, because we're losing marshes and we're not going to gain them all back with the erosion, with sea level rise. This again is Sepauwett on the north side. So this is Sepauwett Road coming over the bridge, or Sepauwett Ave. And this was a stone berm. You can see it wasn't a wall. It was just, I think, just stones that had been cleared from the field that created kind of a berm, again, impounding fresh water, keeping salt water out, and creating an area where invasives did really well. So we removed sections of it. We hope to do more here. We had a very small grant back in 2018, and we did both drainage features in the marsh and tried to connect into this marsh migration area. And this area I showed you an image of earlier. This is blackgrass or juncus, which is a type of rush. And You see some seaside goldenrod. This was in probably early May, and it's one of the first plants to grow, to green up. And within this area was sweetgrass. And I'm finding sweetgrass growing in that area where the marsh is migrating into, unfortunately, Phragmites often. So again, a benefit of managing frag is we might be creating more areas suitable for more diverse species, including sweetgrass. But this was a woman from Nova Scotia, and one of her colleagues found the sweetgrass at this site, and I was invited up to Nova Scotia pre-COVID, and I found sweetgrass at another site so it was really fun that they were teaching me all about the cultural significance of sweetgrass, and I'm now seeing it in places, and that's something that by facilitating marsh migration, I hope that we're improving conditions for diverse species that have some cultural significance as well. So this is when we talk about marsh migration facilitation, it's pretty low tech, just removing some stones and structures. And then instead of having a field going right down to the water's edge, it's now been planted with native grasses and pollinator species. And this was in, I think, potatoes and squash, and had a lot of runoff.
Well, I'll tell you, Wenley, this is remarkable work, and it's so good to see results that are plainly visible. I'm sure when you're out there digging runnels, you're wondering what's going to happen here. But clearly, with the amount of work that you're doing, you're getting a huge payoff, and I think. What's really important is for people to understand how this environment can be, with relatively minimal effort, re-engineered to bring back a natural environment that pre-existed settlement here. And if we can just get behind people's efforts to understand this and see the importance of this work, I think in 20 or 30 years, it's going to show a remarkable payoff.
And that's why I'm boring you. I'm just going to, Walker Farm's another site. We've done some work, an old, again, farm with fill. The edge was concrete dumped along the edge, most likely filled marsh that they turned into a farm. And we've pulled back that fill, and we're allowing this lawn area to turn back into a salt marsh. And this is us planting it this spring. And then the Kickamuit is the one where we hope we can see these dams removed in the next year. The good news is, since I met with you 2 years ago, we got DOT to change their plan to just repave Schoolhouse Road. This is just below the upper dam, and it was flooding already. And if we took out the upper dam, we were going to increase flooding of Schoolhouse Road. So we couldn't do that, of course. So they agreed. They said, if Bristol County Water figures out how to remove these two dams, we will not only put new culverts or new pipes, we will elevate the road. And I was out here just a few weeks ago, and this is the new culvert. Actually, oh shoot, I'm looking downstream. I'm sorry, I got the wrong perspective, but you can see the difference here. And so now there's connectivity for the river to flow back in, especially when it becomes tidal, to flow back and forth.
It will return to the estuary it was in the 19th century.
Which is such a cool thing. And that's why we're so interested, is to allow that marsh to have a place to migrate. And the great thing is animals are already coming back. Like the blue crab population is already pretty robust there. And we're working with DEM. They're putting out these concrete structures, which act as like some structure for oysters to settle on.
Right.
And there's a natural oyster set just downstream of the dam.
Wow.
And they're very interested in trying to protect it because they think it could be, it's never been tampered with. And and they want to try to enhance the oyster population. So it's been fun working with people thinking about how we can bring back the ecology of this site as
And
well.
when the lower dam is done, we expect the heron to start running again.
Yeah, and access for people. People now will be able to paddle back and forth just like they did historically. So, and
it also restores the wading place to cross the river. Because that was referred to in a lot of the early writings of the colonists when they came from further east, they would wade across the river around Child Street someplace.
It makes sense. I mean, it was a little kind of choke point there, and that's why they probably put the dam there, because it was the narrowest part. So, so I guess saying, I wanted to give you an update, and also I like to share information before we go to permitting for these projects. And we have a whole bunch of projects in the marshes coming up. And I shared with you 4, Fogland, and the 3 on the Palmer River, and then the Jacobs Point, and Sepauwett. So I'd love to, if there's interest in learning more, getting involved, ever doing a field trip to a site, as well as just, instead of just receiving notification through a permitting process, I wanted to share information. And then from talking to Dave and learning more about the natural heritage designation, a lot of these restoration projects could be part of that. What are we trying to do to restore the ecology and and some of the cultural significance of this area, and where the two go hand in hand, where we're bringing back, for example, eels or oysters to these areas that could have had them historically.
Yep, this is very important work, and it's going to be part of our feasibility study. So we can share the recording of your presentation with anybody who wants to know more, and it's a great jumping off point for all the projects that we can do in the next 10, 15 years around here. So I really appreciate your sharing this information and giving us the complete story of what's going on here. Hopefully, Tracy and Sagamore, you can make this available to other people on the council so that they can get a better understanding of what's been taking place here. And
yes, definitely.
Yeah. So I thank you for taking the time, Wenley, to present this to us.
And I just looked at my clock. I am sorry. I took way too much of your time tonight. I apologize. And
you know what? I loved what you showed us. And I thank you. It's a lot of work, a lot of, effort that you've put into it, and the results are being seen, and we, really have to keep pushing and rally behind you.
Right.
And again, I'd love to collaborate more, because there are opportunities. All these projects, you saw people, and I involve the community in plantings, and there's opportunities at Soames Preserve. There's and for people who don't want to do the hands-on work, there's opportunities just to come and learn and walk sites. So thank you for allowing me to join you again, and we'll keep the lines of communication open, and hopefully we can meet in person one of these days. And Jeremy, is your hand up for me, or is it up for someone else? Before I
it is, Wenley. Yeah, thanks. I hope I don't open a can of worms here, but first of all, fantastic work. I moved down to Virginia about 2 years ago after living in Rhode Island for 12 years, and it's amazing the work that Save the Bay has done and is continuing to do, and it's really great to be updated about it. But one thing that I wanted to sort of ask about is when you think about sort of landscape restoration and the indigenization of landscape, we do know quite a bit about how things were managed in the 16th and 17th century, and then of course you have a continual sort of, legacy of stewardship, even under colonial conditions, up and down the East Coast and Eastern Algonquin nations. And one of the things that became very, very illegal very quickly once the colonists established hegemony was fire management, right? The use of fire to manage marshes, to manage understory, to manage old growth, right? And so I'm wondering if, the state or if any of the towns, what they think about fire as a way to manage, wetland and marsh sort of retreat or relocation, because down here in the Chesapeake, we're having some really interesting indigenous co-management sort of initiatives that are being launched, where the traditional ecological knowledge is literally helping manage the space, and it's bringing back three square, which is a native bulrush. It's bringing back sweetgrass. It's bringing back the beavers and the muskrats that eat the three square, right? And so you get that succession, but it's because humans are in the natural environment in a way that is not exclusively dominant, but is instead, attended to those relationships. And so certainly the Pokanoket are I'm sure, party to that and want to sort of engage that as well. But I wondered specifically on fire, because there's so many regulations about it, where Save the Bay comes down and where the state comes down on its use.
I know at least Rhode Island, they do fire management out, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Refuge has used fire as a management tool. For Phragmites, and Jeremy, I don't know what you're finding in the Chesapeake. The jury's out if it is used. It doesn't. We had a case in point. Jacobs Point had a legal fire back in 2009. And it was really helpful for me because I was able to access things I never could have accessed because the poison ivy grows in the Phragmites. I couldn't get into sections of this marsh.
Right.
But it came back, all that biomass was standing, and then it's then it turns into ash, and then it's more nutrients for Phragmites to come back.
For Phragmites,
vigorous.
for sure.
But I would think, some of that understory, the invasives in the understory or along edges of fields, and to keep that successional habitat. And it's really interesting in this freshwater meadow that Rock is leading the management of. We thought we were going to have to do a lot more seeding to bring back, because it had been in hay. So we're thinking, okay, we have to get rid of the hay, non-native, and plant. There are so many cool rare species in this field already without us lifting a finger. But it's managing the invasives that are everywhere. And that's, so that management tool of invasives, fire as a management tool for invasives, I think is something that I'd be more interested in looking at. I think on Phragmites, it might not be that useful.
That makes sense.
A tool.
Yeah, that makes sense.
You guys, hi, I'm Andrea.
Hi, Andrea.
Could you clarify something for me about the use of fire? Did the indigenous communities use fire?
100%. Yeah.
Intentionally to manage their crops or what to manage? What did they do?
To manage and create edge habitats that would be conducive to, wild, semi-wild domesticates, right? Like passion fruit flower, or like comfrey or dock or curly dock or the medicines, right? That would come back, springing back in fire disturbed habitats, and also berries, elderberry, things like this that would come back and then would attract a game, right? So a managed patchwork environment that was quite different from the garden where crops would be planted, right? But it was a human affected, not a human dominated, but a human affected landscape that went from marsh to forest to upland, the whole thing, right? And so
there, but I didn't know about. I'm still learning a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that term, human affected versus human dominated, and that's and the challenge is you take Little Soames, and there is a building to the south that we're trying to maybe in the future maybe de-pave some of the parking lot. There's the fire management's trickier because of the extent of the built environment too, around these areas. We don't have as much open spaces like areas along the Chesapeake, and we don't have that. That's
Right.
what's cool about the Palmer and the Taunton. You have this tidal fresh system. And,
Yep.
and the next time you look at the Palmer River, unfortunately, you get north of Swansea and it is dominated by Phragmites in that fresh tidal area,
Soaking it up.
which is
Yeah.
unfortunate. And, I don't know how to manage that level of Phragmites in that type of system. I'm not there yet. I would love to get more input, and it's just unfortunate. But one thing, and again, for indigenous communities, how Phragmites is a native species, and we have a native stand of Phragmites that my colleague identified back in like 2003 at Jacobs Point, and it's right on the bike path. And there's one other stand out on Block Island that we know of. And where were we the other day that I thought I could have seen a Phragmite? There's another area I was wondering if there's some native frag. So, trying to preserve this one little patch of native frag is really important too.
Do you establish its nativity based on isotope analysis?
Yes, that's what I believe it was. It was done. This individual from Delaware came up and took a sample and confirmed it was native Phragmites. So all this in the Somes Heritage area, and and there's a lot more to do, and I didn't even get over into the Taunton area, but there's a lot right here.
Don't worry, the Somes Heritage area is the place
okay
where all of this is happening, and where we want to bring national attention to what's going on here. And that clearly includes all the work that you and so many other people have been doing in the environment here. That's just as important as any other aspect of this heritage area. So thank you so much.
Thank you all, and hopefully we'll meet you in person one of these days.
Okay.
Take care.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Bye.